Good day. Today is the 29th of November and 2024, and a couple of weeks ago really, I was a keynote speaker for a conference, and I'm recording my keynote address since it wasn't recorded back then, and I'm going to do it as I normally do for posterity to put on my YouTube channel as a record. So the conference was the 6th South African Society for Critical Theory Conference, held at Howard College in University of Natal, KwaZulu-Natal that is, from the 14th to the 16th of November, and I presented on the 15th of November. The conference was themed Critical Theory, Digital Media, and the Future of Democracy. So quite weighty subjects, if you like. And I was talking to the Society of Critical Theorists of South Africa. So I named my talk Changing the Narrative, a Global South Perspective. And I was speaking as both a documentary photographer, somebody who operates in the media space, as well as an artist. So my talk went as follows. My formative years as a documentary photographer were shaped primarily in the alternate or independent media space. And it is in this context that I gained an appreciation for the role of alternative media. This was back when I was a member of the Afropix Photography Collective and Agency. Obviously, back in the early 80s, which is when I began my career in earnest, most of the mainstream media was still very compromised in the apartheid project. And most of the pushback against the nationalist racist regime took place in this alternative media sphere. Currently, there is very little space or role for documentary photography, maybe for documentary filmmaking, but not so much for still imaging. At least there is little to no support for such endeavor. So almost no commissioned work, not much space for publishing such work in the public sphere, and very little appetite for paying for such produced work. And although documentary photography occupies an awkward space in the art world, it is really a poor cousin to the arts in general. As a doyen of the documentary photography world once said, the age of documentary photography is now past. In a context where we are awash in digital imaging, which is of course indeed an irony in the context of an age of the digital revolution, which has placed a camera in almost every pocket, and the world is awash with imaging, which I have described in one of my blog posts on the digital revolution as a digital glut. However, as anyone who has worked in media knows, if such images are not curated, edited, and directed to the appropriate platforms, they may as well not exist. And in a context where algorithms rule the roost, images and narratives deemed inappropriate can simply be memory hold at best and censored at worst. What gets to be seen and therefore considered is vital for the dominant narrative. And such a terrain is keenly contested. A part of contesting that discourse is to curtail the resources allocated to the deviant narratives. That said, the creative act requires producing under all sorts of conditions, including ones of adversity, which is what existed when I entered the field and how I have experienced it pretty much throughout my decades-long career. As a documentary photographer, my work is firmly rooted in reality, and that contemporary contemporary reality is seen most acutely from the perspective of settler colonialism, slavery, apartheid, and the concomitant neocolonialism and enduring economic enslavement to these previously colonial entities. I see these conditions primarily from a position of class, that of the working class in particular. In order to improve our perspective on both the democracy that we inherited in 1994 and the emergence of the digital age that accompanied our democracy, we need to take several steps back in time and place in order to assume the panoptic vision needed to more clearly see our contemporary predicament. As my current project, that of a trilogy I call Joining the String, Surviving Dispossession, Genocide, and Erasure, reveals, especially in the already completed first part of the trilogy, entitled Unsettled, 100 Years War of Resistance by Xhosa to Boer and British. Our malaise as a nation runs deep in time and remains linked to imperial empires and their contemporary iterations that remain complicit to this day. Contemporary South Africa, with its contemporary origins in 1652 as a corporate-controlled entity, is now firmly embedded in and captive to its corporate, settler, colonial, and imperial past, and now neo-colonial present, as well as its current neoliberal corporate-dominated economy, and wrestles and rides with the contradictions of this past and present, which manifest in legalized corporate wealth extraction, continued slave wage labor conditions, extreme wealth versus poverty inequality, mass unemployment, corruption, little to no investment in its people, and a loss of hope. Indeed, almost the entire continent of Africa is tied to the neocolonial yoke of its colonized past, hobbled by the underdevelopment dictated by the Western-controlled financial instruments of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the like, and doomed through the dictates of neoliberal economics to provide its global role as suppliers of cheap resources, both human and mineral, to the producing and dominant West. South Africa emerged from its apartheid past at this critical juncture as a new world order was emerging, dominated by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of a unipolar superpower, the United States of America, with its particular brand of globalization cementing our role in the neoliberal economic order as subalterns and vassals. Today, the working and middle classes of the West, traditionally the heartland of the economy of rampant wealth extraction globally, and typified as beneficiaries of the capitalist and imperialist economic order, find themselves increasingly dispossessed, subject to the logic of predatory wealth accumulation, as well as the erosion of hard-won civil liberties, diminishing incomes, job losses, and incrementally increasing wealth disparity. They too experience the rise of discontent and take to the streets in protest. We witness also, as a response to climate change, the attempts by this iniquitous capitalist economic order, itself facing the imminent collapse of a 1.8 quadrillion, and I repeat, quadrillion dollar derivatives bubble masquerading as the Western financialized economy, to reinvent itself through such shenanigans as the Great Reset, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the Green New Deal, which are global banker and neoconservative-led initiatives towards their New World Order. But we witness, too, how rebellious natives resist their subaltern vassal status and are rising as economic powers, resisting the geopolitical devices that ensured their submission in the past, and are now threatening the financier oligarchs with existential dread. In fact, beyond the understanding of the world through a Western lens and what we consider to be the West, which up to recently, ironically, included South Africa, being in fact around 20% of the global population, albeit a very powerful and influential minority. The world is in fact experiencing a significant epochal and hegemonic shift as it moves from a unipolar world order to a multipolar one, in which power moves from west to east. The resultant contestations of this shift are of a seismic nature, as the West resists losing its centuries-long dominant position, bringing the machinations of age-old geopolitical divide-and-conquer tactics that brought it to dominance into full play as the West strives to retain the status quo. While our continent lies captive to an imperial empire, so does that of the South American subcontinent as well, as until recently parts of Asia and Eurasia, making a full 2/3 of humanity victims of a rapacious Western imperial system. A growing solidarity of the global South is emerging to confront and hopefully, I think with all certainty, defeat the ravages of the present rules-based order, which is itself devoid of international law. Practically and tangibly, this new alliance is being birthed in the newly minted BRICS alliance, which is a polycentric world order based on independence, sovereignty, and consensus decisions, as well as the principles of non-interventionism, national sovereignty, and the right of all nations to develop as enshrined in the UN Charter, and in total opposition to the rules-based order ideologues who only look at the world through the lens of a Hobbesian zero-sum game and a limits to growth matrix, expressed most pertinently by American exceptionalism and the primacy of US imperial interests. BRICS has just recently grown with the addition of a further 4 countries to the Johannesburg Conference of 2023 and a further 13 countries in the recent conference of Kazan, Russia, about a month, just over a month ago. The BRICS Plus economy now supersedes that of the G7 economy, with the G7 share of GDP under 30% and that of the BRICS over 33%. The G7 population is less than 10% and that of the BRICS Plus over 40% of humanity. At the heart of the BRICS alliance is the reform of the international financial architecture, with the creation of the BRICS New Development Bank, cross-border national currencies, a SWIFT alternative, BRICS Clear platform, blockchain distributed ledger technology, and a central bank digital currency. These combined efforts are already significantly replacing the dollar as reserve currency means of global exchange and control. The US has dominated the Bretton Woods institutions through its veto power control. The president of the World Bank has always been an American, and the managing director a European. BRICS, of course, has an open door policy for Western countries. And given the meltdown currently underway in European and North American economies, they may well be forced to join the queue waiting to join the BRICS Plus in the not too distant future. Our entry into a digital world as a species, one defined by a divergence from the physical to that of the intangibility of the digital, which is a map, not a territory, is to enter a new and foreign environment, which, whilst it is itself inevitable, is compounded by the fact that it is done without the control and consent of us, the people, driven as it is by shadowy corporate cartels and big money elite interests, and described by sociologist Shoshana Zuboff in her groundbreaking work, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power, as, and I quote, a global system of behavioral modification and control, and ominous behavioral futures markets, where predictions about our controlled behavior are bought and sold, which threatens human nature in the 21st century, just as industrial capitalism disfigured the natural world. End of quote. And that natural world includes us humans. And I would add, colonialism and slavery did in the 19th and 20th century. We, the people, need to be hip to this scene and fight for our right to control these technologies, which are our birthright in every configuration, be it automation and robotics, nanotechnologies, machine learning, or artificial intelligence, with transhumanism itself perhaps being a bridge too far. Technology is here to stay, and like every tool used by man since the inception of humanity, can either liberate or enslave us, depending on whose hands it is in, i.e., who owns and controls it. In the West, technology is owned almost exclusively by billionaires and corporations who collude with governments to develop these technologies, largely through the military-industrial complex, with the people's beneficiation very low, if at all, on the agenda. We are regaled with lurid and scary tales of how artificial intelligence is the slippery slope to transhumanism and the merging of man and machine, and the very inevitability of this outcome. Transhumanism has long been the wet dream of sci-fi authors for at least a century now. And even though all AI is capable of is transmuting vast amounts of information, a very impressive feat in itself, which will no doubt radically transform our built environment, landscape, and even means of livelihood, machines are a long way from being embodied with the sentient, creative reason that is man's domain alone. And talking about the military-industrial complex, which is the heart of controlling this new emergence of this technology, perhaps I should introduce the term coined by Ray McGovern, who is a former CIA analyst and co-founder of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPS, VIPS, which is that of the MICIMATT, the MICIMATT, which stands for Military, Industrial, Congressional, Intelligence, Media, Academia, Think Tank, which encompasses the full breadth of the machine of empire. It's worth considering the rise of the Fourth Estate in the West, and that of the invention of the Gutenberg press in 1436 and the revolution it presaged. The first people to take full advantage of this new technology, besides the clergy, were the pamphleteers, who were political activists, subversives, and revolutionaries who employed this novel ability to faithfully reproduce thought and ideas and spread them far and wide throughout their demographic. These ideas were largely anathema to the rulers of the day, so-called aristocrats and their clergy partners, who for a century tried everything possible to shut this heresy down, including bans, banishments, imprisonment, torture, and death. What finally worked was regulation, requiring so-called publishers to register for a very nominal fee and then raising that registration fee exponentially over a very short space of time, which itself necessitated the rise of advertising to meet the rising costs of registration and publishing. And of course, entrapping publishers to the dictates of whoever paid for the adverts, namely financial power. A similar process is underway in the online alternative media space, including so-called social media, which, with the advent of digital publishing, became the contemporary equivalent of the Gutenberg press. As conventional power tries to retain its grip on the narrative and curtail the control of the myriad voices that have been unleashed by the digital revolution that unlocked Pandora's box of information dangerous to the status quo. So-called social media is where much of the online world gets its information from. I myself used it for this purpose, as well as sharing relevant information on these platforms. Amongst the youth, this is prevalent. And the US is currently trying its best to curtail TikTok, since it became apparent that this is how Western kids got to know there is a genocide underway in Gaza and now Lebanon, and not the mainstream or legacy media, who are largely following the Western line that there is no genocide taking place, and our eyes are deceiving us, and all that is happening is Israel protecting and defending itself. In fact, in the hybrid global war that the West is waging, media and information are at the heart of the struggle, and fake news in the mainstream media is the order of the day. Fake news, peddled by all the legacy Western media, is how we were lured into the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war and occupation, the overthrow of the Libyan government, and the assault on Syria. Mainstream media also facilitated the crisis in Ukraine, which led to the Russian special military operation. Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's seminal work, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, detailed how propaganda is a powerful instrument for social and ideological control, which is especially important to engineering consent in democratic societies. This study goes to great lengths to detail how this exercise is undertaken and maintained. The Ukraine conflict may soon be shut down, largely because the proxy has lost the conflict. All the better to face the greater existential threat, China. A few days ago, the New York Times announced that the US Army is preparing for war in China. That was about 2 weeks ago. Along with fake news, and indeed buoyed by it, are devices such as Russophobia, a term coined by Russian poet Fyodor Tuchev in 1867 as a reference to an irrational fear of Russian otherness. Russophobia has an endurance comparable to anti-Semitism. Hitler's propaganda against the Jews was defined by two styles of language, either scornful derision or of an inferior race, or panic-stricken fear of the threat to civilization. Russophobia has similarly produced two depictions over the past 500 years: disdain for Russians as uncivilized people, and simultaneously as an immense threat. Propaganda is being widely used in the West to maintain the image of Russia as an enemy, as it creates and shares a shared opinion and a collective identity. The Russiagate conspiracy, kicked off by Trump's first ascent to the US presidency in 2016 by a disgruntled Clinton campaign and an even more disgruntled Democratic National Convention, National Committee, a convention committee that is, which had actively worked to undermine the Democrat Bernie Sanders campaign, who was by far the popular people's choice at the time, but not sufficiently neoconservative, in favor of the more hawkish, pro-war, neoconservative candidate Hillary Clinton. When this gambit backfired and Clinton lost to Trump, the DNC took to a 4-year campaign to smear the Trump administration as being a Russian asset, all without proof, and every accusation being thoroughly debunked, including the 50-odd intelligence operatives who maintained that there was no validity to the Hunter Biden laptop, and that this was all fake news generated by the evil Russians to besmirch the Democrats. MSM, mainstream media, was largely complicit in spreading these fake narratives. Cue xenophobia today, which is now ramping up in spades. My personal encounter of just how carefully information is curated came when I finally got access to the South African University Central Library about 20 years ago. To my disappointment, only 2 books in the 200 or so list I presented were available within the entire library. This was the National Library. This, to my mind, remains the situation to this day. Academia is certainly a site of struggle in the information domain. Hence its inclusion by Ray McGovern in the extended MICIMAT definition of full spectrum dominance control, according to the Wolfowitz doctrine adopted in 1994, when we here in South Africa entered our democratic state, which is a plan for American hegemony, in which the United States would seek to maintain the position that it came out of the Cold War with, in which there were no obvious or plausible challenges to the hegemony of the United States. And you can include academia as part of the toolbox. We also need to be cognizant of how art and culture is instrumentalized and weaponized towards geopolitical and hegemonic ends, typified by, for instance, the Central Intelligence Agency and its Congress for Cultural Freedom as largely unwitting Cold War warriors, and question to what extent such intelligence operations perpetuate to this day as we enter a new Cold War and are exhorted by the very same forces to again re-embrace a Cold War 2.0 stance. Do we once again become these unwitting Cold War warriors? Or worse, do we wittingly enter the fray on the side of the elites? It is philosophies of being, of what it means to be human, which will decide the future of humanity in these new technological frontiers. And it is not inevitable that we humans need to be dominated, enslaved, or indeed made obsolete by technologies of our own making, which have the possibility of in fact liberating us. And it is in light of the above that I seek to understand both dominant philosophies that control and define our existence, such as that of Aristotle's, elevated by the elites above that of Plato and Socrates, of being governed by noble thought and intent, which have given us the reduced democracy of today, which continues to serve elite interests and their corporate fascism. The philosophical constructs within which artists find themselves embedded are key to understanding how artists react, respond, and create. Within an African and global South context, such philosophical approaches have largely been of a communal nature, understanding humanity as a conjoined system, one dependent and interdependent on the other. In the Southern African context, this is articulated and understood through the notion of Ubuntu, the concept and philosophical state that is informed by the understanding and belief that I am because you are, and that all is connected. If the world has been until now divided by a West versus Global South binary, the Global South has been typified by an Ubuntu, communal, people-centered approach, expressed by systems such as communalism, socialism, and communism, which place the needs of the people above those of corporations and wealthy elites. This approach, which even though battered and undermined by the imperial efforts of empire, colonialism, and capital, remains alive and well through its continued survival despite being amongst the victims of this rapacious extractivist system. Western iterations of philosophies of being, typified by those of the existentialists such as Kant, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Marcuse, and Nietzsche, and others, who supposedly critiqued from a Marxist perspective, were part of an essential pivot to a postmodern world that firmly brought the crucible of culture to the heart of empire. And we are essential outcomes and are an essential outcome of and legacy of the Cold War and the direction Western art was subjected to by the Congress of Cultural Freedoms, tasked as it was to bring the center of the Western art world from Paris to Washington and New York, fitting for the new empire, the center of empire the US had become. The freedoms expressed by modern art in abstract expressionism, conceptual art, and the like were perfect to reflect the so-called freedoms of democracy versus the perceived rigidity and antiquity of that of the Soviet Union and a dying European civilization and culture. This postmodern and post-truth world, or indeed evidence-free world, that we entered no longer produces much beyond narratives, and is also the perfect vehicle for the conditions which are being encountered in Europe and the collective West today, morphing into identity politics, breaking down humanity into smaller and smaller demographics, perhaps the easier to divide and conquer. Art itself is not some immutable force, imperturbable to the material conditions in which it resides. Inasmuch as art is an act of creation, occasioned by creation itself, it remains embedded in the social realities in which it exists, and bound by its ability to project into society and beyond. Much like a plant in the shadow of a large tree is circumscribed by its geographic locations, its survival and growth dependent on its ability to adapt to its particular situation. The societal context within which art resides is of critical importance, as it both affects and is affected by the art-making process. In light of the above, we see that globally, and certainly in Africa, art remains firmly dominated by its Western iterations. The West, largely through monetary means, as well as the subterfuge of the CIA's creation of modern art mentioned above, which continues to dominate globally to this day and continues to determine broadly what constitutes art, its value, currency, and impact. Art has been industrialized, even ironically as the West is de-industrialized, with an overemphasis on commodification, scarcity or rarity, and speculation. And so, even as artists located in the global South, we are obliged to reflect on this hegemonic paradigm and respond accordingly. An important caveat, hardly whispered in the West, is that this art environment or ecology, this art industry, is soon itself to be subjected to the seismic shocks that will accompany the power shift from west to east, and from the west to the global south and the global majority. The accompanying certain financial collapse of the Western economy will undoubtedly have a huge impact on the art world in general. When looking to the current so-called order of the West, what is it exactly that we see? Europe finds itself bound by the decisions of an unelected European Union elite bureaucracy and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization military imperatives, which once again lead Europe into war as sacrificial lamb and proxy for empire, denying Europe of its natural proclivity for a Eurasian future. Europe being, of course, part of the Eurasian landmass and continent, as it is. Europe is also being deindustrialized, willingly through a misplaced New Green Deal ideology and Russophobia, and has shut down all avenues to affordable energy, sometimes through outright coercion, as in the mysterious sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Of course, the Nord Stream pipeline still exists, though ideology does not permit its use. Germany, once the heartland of European industry, now faces fiscal collapse and a government in disarray. The US is faced with internal power struggles as the duopoly is threatened by outsider forces attempting to wrest power for as yet uncertain outcomes, and with the resultant loss of focus on US foreign policy to safeguard US global interests. We see that the philosophical values that describe the dystopian reality articulated above are the result of closed system thinking, as defined and articulated by Malthusian entropy, non-growth and limits to growth, scarcity and the resultant competition and management of diminishing resources, geopolitical divisions and wars, in which the biosphere obeys a mathematical equilibrium or stasis. This end of history paradigm views the universe in which we reside as one that is both empty and dying, and not full and expanding, defined by continual growth. It is a paradigm of austerity in which resources are deemed finite, to be accumulated and hoarded, as they are by the elites, in which the resources are to be won at the expense of others, a type of zero-sum thinking, and a paradigm in which the winner takes all. This closed system, as defined by Thomas Malthus, Ricardo, Darwin, J.S. Mills, Thomas Hobbes, and their acolytes, sees an expanding population, indeed humans themselves, as a parasitical force impinging on nature. The nature understood by this Darwinian thinking is seen itself as inert and subject to entropy, and not substantial enough to be shared by all. Nature, seen as finite through this entropic lens, is to be defended from humans, who themselves are seen as a destructive form of animal life, bound by the forces of nature and unable to use creative reason to transform and transcend themselves or nature itself. The measures used by these adherents of a closed system are chiefly austerity, debt, low slave wages, population control, privatization, which is the transfer of wealth upwards to the elites, geopolitics, which has been around since Babylonian times and is most recently expressed by the kind of thinking espoused by imperial geographer Halford Mackinder and the likes of geopoliticians such as Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, Paul Wolfowitz, Jake Sullivan, and other neoconservatives, and its accompanying military economies and endless divide and conquer wars. The rentier liberal economics of Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes, and the neoliberal Austrian school of Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. Milton Friedman's Chicago School of Economics and the Washington Consensus and the hoarding and managing of diminishing resources demonstrated best in the 20 trillion US dollars or more stashed in offshore accounts by the elites. System analysis and cybernetics are at the basis of this mathematical and computer-generated vision and reality, which is itself a technocratic dictatorship of the type espoused by the writer and futurist Alvin Toffler. To the above, one can add regime change wars and coups to put in place compliant vassal state managers, mass migration that results from the regime change wars, economic destabilization and blockades, including unilateral coercive measures or sanctions, covert sponsorship of terrorist groups in the service of regime change operations, narcotics economies, and mass opioid addiction. The employ of technology such as surveillance and its corollary in surveillance capitalism, artificial intelligence, automation and corporate censorship, narrative control via an almost entirely oligarch-owned mainstream media is a vital component of this system, and censorship is now becoming the order of the day. Propaganda, which is skillfully applied and has never been as endemic in the West, is a powerful instrument for social and ideological control, which is especially important to engineer or manufacture consent in democratic societies, as is the mission creep of totalitarian legislation such as the Patriot Act. The democracy that the West inflicts on the global South, already problematized by Plato 2 millennia ago, is hardly to be found in the West itself. And here we have recently witnessed the spectacle that passes for US democracy, where clearly the will of the people is misplaced. Numerous polls showed that 8 in 10 Democrats wanted to stop supplying weapons to Israel, but they were ignored and probably protested in the recent elections by withholding their vote, as the low voter turnout would suggest. A similar process is occurring in Europe, where the average citizen is against the war in Ukraine, doesn't want their countries to be arming, but their hands are tied. The bureaucrats in Brussels, the EU bureaucrats, and indeed their political elite insist on feeding the Ukraine war, which is in fact a huge grift of huge amount of theft of public funds. Western democracy, and especially that of the duopoly in the US, is circumscribed by elite control of both media and governments. And Western media are echo chambers for this official narratives. Liberal and imperial intolerance to other systems of governance and outright totalitarianism in its intention to impose its version of democracy and the present neoliberal order, which is vastly different to that what was understood as a liberal outlook in the 70s. This was shifted by something that I've learned recently called the third way, developed by a sociologist, and I'll talk at some later stage by that, and adopted by Blair and Obama and a whole lot of people as a way of behavioral control to shift people from being. So that's why we no longer see the definedness of the left, the traditional left and right that we knew, and the shades in between. So the liberals embraced diversity in the 70s and 80s. Now it is a fig leaf to cover an imperial construct of predatory corporate cartels, imposing rules which benefit only the cartels. It is an order held in place by US and NATO military power. The Great Reset and Fourth Industrial Revolution, the World Economic Forum, along with the Green New Deal, promise a further and darker dystopian future, especially for us in the global south. Elite figures such as World Economic Forum's Klaus Schwab, whose self-proclaimed main influence is the neoconservative Henry Kissinger and the Trilateral Commission, and Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England, who drive this Malthusian project, promise us that you will own nothing and be happy. This while they and their millionaire and billionaire associates own pretty much everything and work at resetting a defunct economy teetering on the verge of collapse in their own image and with our manufactured consent. This malevolent 1% bad actors, these malevolent 1% bad actors and their enablers cannot be entrusted with any reform or restructuring of society in ways which benefit human and all other life forms, and more importantly, the ecological health of the planet. Here in the global south, we are assured that we will not be allowed to be producers of the requirements needed to live, let alone thrive, and will be paid a fee no doubt set by the globalists for the natural settings we reside in a carbon offset trade-off to barely survive. Naturally, in true mafia style, this directive, dictated by the very creators of the changing climatic conditions that we had absolutely no hand in producing, is an offer we cannot refuse. In other words, we are to remain trapped in the slave and servitude conditions that have existed since slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, and which are the products of these exploitative and sociopathic systems. And to spell it out more clearly, this means that over 1 billion people in Africa will have to settle for what they have today, or it would be more appropriate to say what they don't have today, which is access to clean water, energy, food, health, education, and other basics of life and civilization. In considering our age and the times we are living through, I have come to understand and comprehend the centrality of geopolitics and economics in the dramas playing out, called The Great Game by Empire. Geopolitics, as defined by its contemporary creator Alfred Mackinder's Heartland Theory, which is who rules East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, who rules the world island commands the world. This theory, continued by his neoconservative acolytes such as former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, and contemporaries such as the former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland, who is the architect of the Ukrainian crisis and who has just recently been appointed to the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which is a CIA front, and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, is playing out now in Ukraine and the Baltic states, and indeed the deindustrialization of Europe. Along with geopolitics is, of course, economics, expressed and contested mostly in that of the real versus the financialized economy or speculation, derivatives. A derivatives bubble of 1.8 quadrillion exists, and hypothecation, also known as the casino economy, into which a politically liberated South Africa entered post-1994, and with the advent of the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy, or GEAR, which of course is the expression of the neoliberal economy that was proto-tested in the post-Allende coup of Chile's Pinochet, and spread like a gasoline-fueled wildfire around the world since. This failed model, which did irreparable damage to our frail South African economy, is now shape-shifting into the Green New Deal economy of the World Economic Forum. The world is thus at a crossroads. Indeed, large parts of it are crossing over to a new paradigm, departing from the centuries-old one defined by war, austerity, scarcity, dispossession, exploitation, inequality, degradation and lack, hunger and fear, into one of abundance, in which all humanity is treated as equal, and all life valued and deemed sacrosanct. The old order, defined by a unipolar power, is dying, and a new world, typified by the emerging multipolar or multinodal order, created by the global majority and its billions of global South people, is rising to join and build this world of hope and possibility. This may sound like a utopian, unachievable dream, but the paradigm in which it is being created is both tangible and credible. There are countless meetings and encounters of people building this new world order, largely unreported by the West. The counter-prevailing order of the closed system thinking is that of open system theory, expressed and articulated best by Ukrainian-Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, where the biosphere, the thin envelope over the face of the globe which shapes and is shaped by living matter, is not a closed system and defined by entropy, as is assumed by Darwinians, but rather an open system shaped by the intersection of cosmic radiation and internal radiation emanating from within the earth, and is perceived as being in a state of anti-entropy, in which life evolves in non-linear leaps from lower to higher states of life, and from unconscious life to conscious life, and from conscious life to self-conscious thinking life. A higher process of creation of new systems is at play here, always moving towards expressing ever greater degrees of freedom of action and complexity towards the expression of human life. In open systems theory, resources are understood as infinite, subject only to creative access, and challenges are pure potential. In an open system, the biosphere is not only cosmic in nature, but a singular process, directed by a flow of creative disequilibrium towards ever higher states of anti-entropy and creation, not death, homogenization, or decay. Vernadsky writes, and I quote, "The creation resulting from new forms of living forms adapts itself to new forms of existence, augments the ubiquity of life, enlarges its domain. Life penetrates thus the regions of the biosphere where it had not earlier had access." End of quote. When humanity appeared on the scene, a new geological phenomena began expressing itself in a form which Vernadsky described as the noosphere, in which atoms are organized by human thought, as opposed to the lithosphere, in which atoms are organized in non-biotic nature, and the biosphere, in which atoms are organized in biotic nature. A new geological force to be driven by human creative reason. A new phenomenon on our planet, in which, for the first time, man becomes a large-scale geological force capable of rebuilding the province of his life by his work and thought, rebuilding it radically in comparison with the past, as wider and wider creative possibilities open before him, guided by asymmetrical harmony and progress from lower to higher states of organization. In Vernadsky's mind, neither the noosphere nor the biosphere obeys a law of mathematical equilibrium or stasis. Back to documentary photography, which, like art and everything else, is in the West embedded in this closed system Western philosophy, ideology, and economy, and subject to its death throes. Our role as cultural workers, or however we define ourselves, is to critique this moment, both the economy and its effects, including its demise and the rise of the new world order. It is the very nature of art to resist and rise beyond the confines of containment. As an artist, an observer and commentator of life, and located in the global south, I choose to embrace a concept of universal and earthly abundance, and to forego fear and its concurrent notion of scarcity and lack, even as I myself live within the paradigm of a manufactured scarcity, austerity, and accompanying fear, holding firm to the knowledge of an abundant, expansive, and full universe. I see clearly that the scarcity that defines my world is not at one with universal principles and is entirely manufactured. A paradigm whose time is now passing, and I choose to align myself with the new energies that sweep the planet as we move from a unipolar world to one of multipolarity, where we employ our human creative reason to birth a more abundant reality for all humans, and indeed all life within our biosphere. And I'll end here. And thank you for watching.